Welcome, everybody. My name is Cliona Raleigh. I'm the president of ACLED, and today I am going to be introducing our new special project on violence targeting local officials, and also, of course, Dr. Andrea Carboni, who is behind the project, and he will then be introducing all of our extremely excellent panelists who have written case studies on particular cases that we think might be of interest. So I'm going to introduce this project, like I mentioned, and also the data that's behind it. And in particular, these data have been collected and tagged from 2018. They are now available and updated in real time as you wish, and you can download it as you wish on the typical ACLED sites. So I would like first to give, of course, an overview of the purpose of this project. If we can go to the next slide, please. These are us. I'm the moderator with Andrea and the panelists. And the next slide, please. Great. And then perfect. So here we have aggregated official targeting by country from 2018 up until last week. And as you can see, there's quite a range. The purpose of this project and the specialized tagging is to provide an accurate, timely, and consistent record of when, where, and how local officials have been targeted. I'm going to review some basic patterns here before we go on to these case studies in the data and look at these at a global scale. And of course, some forecasted trends and the logic behind these attacks. So first, I want to be clear about who local officials are, and they include governors, mayors, councilors, local civil servants, or any real local formal elite with authority at the local level. And they are responsible for a number of local government functions. Their actions determine the pace, direction of policy, of course, development, law, order, often security, and of course, representation. And they function as gatekeepers, often for upper level elites, and for an entry point for engaging with regimes for citizens, of course. And so when we're thinking about the role of local government and the risks that these officials face, we should think about, of course, who is in charge of what and who is served by their authority, why threaten these officials, and what are the intended consequences of threatening these officials. And they include, of course, being the replacement of authorities, control of the population and territory, but also what are the unintended consequences, which is that a serious decline in trust and legitimacy, and of course, tends to be an increase in militarization. So what we find and what we'll be discussing throughout this session here is that there are multiple armed groups that tend to focus on or prey on local officials, and they can be insurgents, regime forces, such as pro-government militias, of course, militias from competing elites, communal and local groups, and mobs and rioters. Next slide, please. And what we're suggesting is that the actual patterns that we've discerned since this graph goes from 2019 onwards, and the estimate that we'll see this year, is that the patterns that have led to this thus far are going to both continue and potentially intensify. And it's all the more important to understand the varied ways in which these officials are being targeted by these multiple types of groups. So behind these patterns are really varied logics or reasons. Of course, the first is competition, the second is control, and the third is corruption. So many local authorities will compete with each other using violence, or violence, for example, will be visited upon local officials at the behest of higher scales of government. And this leads to both mob behavior that is being paid for or directed towards these officials, or militias, both that the officials themselves raise or that other contesting officials will use against each other. There's also control dynamics at play here, and this often tends to be insurgents with groups that are eager to demonstrate how they've replaced a government authority or demand that, of course, local officials switch sides. And typically, these tend to be extremely violent events. We can see quite a number of those within the Sahel area, for example. And the third, which has received quite a lot of attention, of course, is corruption. And this tends to be, of course, by not just political criminal groups, cartels, but other groups that encourage or force the compliance, the corruption, the cooperation towards local officials in order to control economic routes, get impunity, punish or constrain the actions of local governments. And so what we see, of course, next slide, please, is that these multiple agents and the multiple reasons they may be engaging in violence against local officials mean that it's present throughout the world. And it's quite intensely present in some specific places that we'll be talking about today. Some other patterns that I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through this session is that we're seeing a very, very high rate of unidentified armed groups claiming to have done these actions. And this lack of direct claims really underpins how both these actions are, of course, highly illegal, but also very taboo. So it is not in the interest of many armed groups to claim direct responsibility for these. However, many of these groups want the consequences of these actions, including, as I mentioned before, rampant continued violence. There is, of course, a lack of self-reporting on the part of these local officials because they don't want to seem like they've lost control of their area. And of course, because the national response is often not to punish those who move against local officials. But what we are seeing, and we've seen throughout the world and for several years, is a rise in protection militias, more police and security presence, for example, militarized elections, and continued concern about the hijacking of social movements. And so these events themselves are kind of a microcosm of the larger forms of disorder that we've noticed have appeared throughout the world, and especially in countries that are democratizing or, for example, expanding their civil service. And so with that, I'm going to hand this over to Andrea Carboni, who is the head of analysis here at ACLED, and he can give you more details. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Cleona. It was a comprehensive review of the rationale for this project. What I'll try to do now is to give a few more details about how we conducted this project and some overall numbers and, of course, some overall considerations that tie together all the case studies that we are investigating. With the release of this special issue, we are inaugurating, this project that is intended to track violence against local officials across the world. Of course, on our dedicated page on the ACLED website, you'll find a link to the special issue and a curated data file that all interested users can access and download using the relevant tag in the tags column. You have a tag there, you can just filter, or of course from the curated data file, you only have those events, and you'll find all events in which violence is used against local officials or property owned by or symbolic of local administrations is targeted or destroyed. In our project, local officials are clearly a subset of the wider universe of all politicians that operate in a specific country and, of course, across the world. We understand them as members of subnational government institutions, from the first level administration division down to cities, towns, villages. But we also include, for example, relatives of local officials. Of course, this applies only to cases where this kin relationship is being reported in the media. The tag doesn't apply to members of the central government or other national level administrations, meaning that you will not find, for example, attacks against like members of parliament unless they are also occupying a role in the local administration in some capacity. We tag these data, as Cleona was mentioning, for the period that goes between 2018 to the present. And we did so using the information that is provided in our notes section. So we isolated events in which local officials were reported and explicitly reported to be the target of violence. So they were victim of violence. In doing so, we are trying to provide users with a new tool that will help navigate through the information available on our website, which of course on our data set, which of course includes occurrences of political violence of different origin across the world. I'll provide some figures about the data themselves. So we recorded a total of 2,100 events, actually over this figure, of violence targeting local officials into 2022 only. I'm referring to last year only. Of course, we should always take these figures as kind of an underestimate of the total violence, meaning that there is a lot of violence that may not be reported, but it gives you an idea of I'd say, the widespread nature of all violence that targets local officials. We record that direct attacks, so things like shootings, stabbings, beatings, but also kidnappings, make up around half of all of these events. These are followed by mob attacks or property destruction, which can be carried out, for example, by unorganized masses or mobs that assault local authorities in cases like violent contestation, for example, or armed groups that destroy property belonging to local administrations. But there are also other cases, for example, bombings or aerial attacks are very common especially in conflict-affected countries such as Myanmar or Ukraine, and we'll go through that in our case studies later. The highest number of events are reported in Southeast Asia, Europe, and South Asia, with Myanmar, India, Mexico, Ukraine, and the Philippines topping the list of countries where violence against local officials is recorded. Yet the violence is also common in countries that are not characterized by active conflicts or high levels of violence more generally. For example, Italy or South Africa. Again, two case studies which we'll be exploring in a minute. So what actually keeps all these cases together are the logics, the goals, and the consequences, something that, again, Cleona hinted at as well. We're talking about targeting that happens in, again, context of active conflicts, Ukraine being one case, but also cases where there is violent political competition and which exacerbates around elections. We have cases in which there is a penetration of organized criminal groups in local government, and so these, the showing that the lines between political and criminal nature and violence are often very blurred, indeed. But also the violent contestation and the contestation that reverberates on local officials. They are the kind of the front line of the state towards their societies. The goals again here are territorial contestation. It's about intimidation. It's about punishing also civilian authorities for not cooperating with again either political actors or criminal groups. And the consequences are various. We'll explore them in a second, but they involve the militarization of local communities, the undermining of social cohesion in some cases, but also discouraging participation in public life. And this is something that we're also aiming to explore beyond this special issue, understanding how, like, the long-term consequences of this violence. I'll stop here and introduce the case studies we'll explore in the rest of the webinar, starting from Mexico with our regional specialist, Sandra Pellegrini. We'll then move on to Ukraine with Nikita Gurkov. we'll cover the European Union with Giulia Bernardi, our research manager for Europe. South Africa with Susanna Dietlefs, Brazil with Giulia Franciotti, our research manager for South America, and finally the Philippines with our researcher Thomas Buenaventura. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Sandra Pellegrini for her exploration of Mexico and, of course, violence against officials there.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. My name is Sandra Pellegrini, and I'm pleased to participate in this webinar today. I'll be sharing some of our findings for Mexico, which I hope you'll find interesting and useful for further investigations on the topic. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So in Mexico, ACLED has recorded more than 1,000 events of violence targeting local officials between 2018 and 2022. Violence has mostly affected local administrators at the municipal rather than state level, such as mayors, city councilors, or other nominated municipal positions, such as individuals in charge of security or finances at the local level. While ACLED has generally been able to collect information on the victim, identifying the perpetrators has been far more difficult amid high levels of impunity, limited resources at the local level to investigate those cases, and also perhaps some levels of self-censorship from media reporting on these cases for safety concerns. And in fact, in the majority of cases recorded in ACLED dataset, the perpetrators of violence are unidentified. If we look at how local administrators are being targeted, we might receive some indications of who the potential perpetrators might be. So we'll see that, for instance, direct attacks account for a large majority of violence, for which organized crime groups are most often blamed for, notably because of the prevailing use of technique, tactics, and procedures that are usually associated to organized crime groups, such as extreme forms of violence or drive-by shootings. However, systematically attributing violence with specific modes of operations to gang has failed to account for the potential intellectual authors of the violence, as we know that other political actors have been able to hire hitmen to pursue acts of violence and use similar technique, tactics, and procedures. Interestingly, we see that the second largest share of physical threats occurred in riots events, such as violent demonstration and mob violence. These events correspond usually to the temporary detentions of local officials or lynching attempts for failing to address their demands. So we've seen several cases of mob violence targeting local officials due to issues with infrastructure, such as access to water or electricity. So this finding indicates that while some cases might be attributed to organized crime group, there's still a significant share of violence that has stemmed from citizenry directly. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So on this map, we can see that violence targeting local official has taken place in all 33 Mexican states, but has not been uniform across the country. The state with the highest number of local official targeting events are Guerrero, followed by Oaxaca and Veracruz, with about 100 events in each state for the 2018-2022 period. Actually, data shows that there is a correlation between level of local official targeting and levels of violence likely stemming from gang activities, more specifically in states of Michoacán, Guanajuato, Guerrero, and Veracruz, which are states where we have consistently recorded active and violent disputes between organized crime groups. So this would sustain that there is a link between organized crime groups' activities and violence targeting local administrators. However, the correlation does not hold true across the Mexican territory. So I've seen in Oaxaca and in some extent in the states of Chiapas. So in the state of Oaxaca accounts for some of the highest number of local official targeting, but does not features among the most violent when looking at political violence that is likely related to gang activity. There, one of the hypotheses is that violence has been linked to local disputes and competitions involving local political boss, also known as caciques, and also that violence has stemmed from divisions within the communities governed by the usos y costumbres participatory electoral system. Next slide, please. We've also found that levels of violence targeting local officials have been affected by electoral cycles, with spikes in the recorded number of events ahead of the 2018 and 2019 election. Here again, organized crime groups are often blamed for violence ahead of elections as a way to influence the outcomes and advantage candidates that can guarantee them favorable conditions for their activities. Political elites are also thought to use the service of non-partisan enforcers or resort to contracted killings to threaten or attack their opponents. So here again, we see that there might be multiple perpetrators. Some of the violence has crystallized before the vote, but also on voting day itself, with the targeting of electoral staff and polling station, either to alter election results or to contest it. While elections have acted as a catalyzer to violence targeting local officials, ACLED data also contributes to highlight that violence persists outside electoral periods, as you can see on this graph. Some of the drivers to consider are that political rivalries and competition for powers also materialize during and beyond administration shifts. Organized crime frequently targets officials who they accuse of collaborating with rival groups or for failing to deliver pre-electoral agreements, for instance. We also continuously record mob violence and demonstration with residents targeting local officials for failing to address their demands beyond electoral cycle. Next slide, please. Perhaps moving on to a few concluding remarks. So this year we have recorded over 100 events of violence targeting local administrators between January and May, which represents an increase compared to level recorded last year over the same periods. As seen during previous electoral cycle, there's fears that the upcoming June 2024 general elections could lead to heightened levels of violence. So the question here is what can be done to prevent local official targeting from continuing unabated? So first, in my opinion, would be to address high levels of impunity and ensure the appropriate investigations of those cases, as well as identify and prosecute the perpetrators of violence. This will enhance the general understanding of the motives behind such violence and favorize the implementations of tools to prevent such violence. For that purpose, it is key to reinforce collaborations between security forces at all levels and involve municipal law enforcement body, which in some municipality might have the best contextual knowledge and are best able to understand the local power dynamics at play. Finally, in order to implement proper preventions and protection mechanism, it is essential to track threats and take steps early on, as while we do observe lots of events of direct violence, threats that could be non-physical or non-direct, such as verbal threats, are usually an indicator of potential escalations into direct and physical violence. So if we are able to track such threats, we might be able to improve mechanism to prevent such threats, such violence early on. I'll stop here. I hope this was insightful, and I'll be available for any follow-up questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra, for your examination of one of the most notorious cases for violence against local officials, with, as you mentioned, like hundreds of local authorities targeted and killed over the past few years. Yet we have also Ukraine, which last year in particular emerged as a prominent case especially after the Russian invasion of February 2022. I'll leave the floor to Nikita Gurkov to lead us into both the pre and the post-war patterns of violence against local officials in Ukraine. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. I will argue that Russian aggression against Ukraine made the local administrators' jobs extremely dangerous. And regardless of whether they stayed loyal to the Ukrainian government or switched sides. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as you can see, last year, ACLED recorded more events than in the previous 4 years combined. And in fact, prior to the war, violence against local administrators was decreasing, though there were still 11 fatalities among them, mostly due to direct attacks. In contrast, last year, ACLED records at least 26 Ukrainian local officials killed by Russian forces and 20 local occupation officials killed by suspected Ukrainian partisans. And this violence is ongoing. Next slide, please. So prior to the war, 70% of events were recorded in 8 of Ukraine's 27 regions. These regions are also the most populous and urbanized, with one exception. Importantly, we found no spike in the number of events around local elections that were held in Ukraine in October 2020. In terms of numbers of events, most of them were recorded in the Odessa region in the south. And Odessa actually even surpassed the capital city of Kiev and the surrounding region, albeit by a small margin. And another hotspot was the densely populated and industrialized east of the country. There was one exception to the rule, the northwestern region of Rivne, and we believe that the unusually high number of events there may have been due to local disputes related to illegal amber mining. A third of events involved perpetrators setting fire to vehicles belonging to local officials or their family members, and on rare occasions to their residences or workplaces. As there were relatively few casualties due to this type of events, we posit that violence was mostly meant to intimidate rather than to kill or injure, and was likely linked to vested interests, as the lines between public office, businesses, and organized crime were often blurred in pre-war Ukraine. Attacks still occurred. They accounted for about a quarter of events, but their number sharply decreased in 2020 and 2021, possibly due to the COVID pandemic and lockdowns. Important to note, there were also no fatalities in those 2 years. In contrast, in 2018 and 2019, we recorded 11 fatalities, most of which occurred in the capital city of Kiev, the surrounding region, which is the site of most political and economic competition in Ukraine. Overall, we recorded 5 local officials killed across Ukraine, and other 6 victims were the staff and relatives of local officials, as well as the self-appointed civilian officials in breakaway regions. One of the most prominent victims was Katerina Handzuk, who was subjected to a fatal attack in July 2018. In addition to being the assistant to the mayor of Kherson in the south, Katerina was a famous anti-corruption activist, and her death from sustained injuries due to the attack prompted waves of demonstrations throughout the country demanding accountability. The case is also an example of violence perpetrated by a fellow local administrator. Just last week, the former head of the Kherson Regional Council and one of his associates were sentenced to 10 years in prison each for ordering and organizing the attack. Next slide, please. So Russian invasion led to a drastic spike in the number of events, and 40% of them were reported in March and April during the Russian attempt to seize Kiev and the initial occupation of Ukraine's northern, eastern, and especially southern regions. During this time, we recorded at least 26 Ukrainian local administrators killed, and most of them were killed in March. This includes 20 local officials killed in a single Russian missile strike on the Mykolaiv Regional Administration building in late March. There were also direct attacks. Also in March, 2 mayors were killed by Russian forces around Kiev city. Yuri Prilipka, the mayor of Hostomel. Hostomel was the site of major fighting due to its proximity to an airfield that Russian forces attempted to use as a bridgehead. And also the head of a village of Motizhin, west of Kiev, Olga Suhenko. She, her husband, and her son were tortured and executed also by the Russian forces. In the meantime, suspected Ukrainian partisans killed Volodymyr Struk, the pro-Russian mayor of Kremin and Luhansk region. As you may know, the town is still on the front line as of today. However, abduction was the preferred method of the Russian occupying forces and accounted for about half of all events, and 3/4 of them were also recorded in March and April last year. Most affected were the occupied parts of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions in the south. Most of the time, local officials were targeted for their refusal to cooperate, and they were also suspected of rallying communities against occupiers. During this period, we recorded about 90 protests in the south of Ukraine until April 2022, after which Russian crackdown made them somewhat impossible. Abductions targeted not only serving officials, but also former ones, pointing to an effort to eliminate any challenge to the Russian authority. Abductions continued to be reported until the annexation of 4 regions by Russia in September, and eventual Russian withdrawal from Kherson city in November. Important to note, the fate of many victims of this practice is still not known, which means that the death toll could be unfortunately higher. Notable case in this regard comes from Kherson again. The mayor of the city, Igor Kolykhaev, carried on his duties despite occupation and was eventually abducted in June 2022. Retreating Russian forces forcibly relocated him during the retreat in November, and his whereabouts are still not known. Next slide, please. And finally, at the same time, we note significant activity linked to suspected Ukrainian partisans targeting Russian appointed and collaborating officials. Most frequently, we saw assassination attempts with the use of explosive devices or grenades. We recorded 34 such incidents, and they resulted in 20 fatalities. Targets were not too high-ranking, probably because reaching more senior officials is difficult due to tightened security. Half of the events occurred in the Zaporizhia region, again in the south, and concentrated in the towns of Melitopol and Berdyansk. As of today, the Zaporizhia region continues to be a hotspot. Since the beginning of this year, we have recorded at least 8 attempts on the lives of Russian appointees and local collaborators, and all but 1 occurred in the Zaporizhia region. Of course, this practice does not go unanswered. Russian efforts to stop these assassinations are ongoing. For instance, last week, the Russian Security Service announced they had detained Ukrainian partisans suspected of plotting assassinations and sabotage in the Zaporizhia region. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita, for the exhaustive exploration of this case, which shows how multiple logics actually exist within a single country and within such a short period of time. I'd say a less known case is instead the European Union, and within the European Union, some countries, especially Italy. I'll leave the floor to my colleague Giulia Bernardi for again an examination of the patterns of violence that we see across this region.
Thank you, Andrea. So the European Union is a region at peace. It's not in an active conflict and largely characterized by the presence of established democratic institutions, and yet local administrators are targeted by acts of violence. Can we please do the next slide, please? So between 2020 and 2022, ACLED recorded violence against local administrators in 16 EU countries out of 27. In most cases, specifically 85% of the total number of events, we do not know who the perpetrators of these violent acts are, as usually they are committed anonymously and they remain unclaimed. And moreover, as the graph shows, the geographical distribution of this violence is very uneven, and 75% of cases are recorded in Italy. Can we move to the next slide? So the targeting of local administrators is a deeply rooted phenomenon in Italy, and it is estimated that between 1975 and 2015, around 132 local administrators were murdered by different perpetrators, such as militant organizations, organized crime groups, and other actors. And between 2020 and 2022, ACLED recorded 238 events in Italy, which is 3/4 of all events reported across the EU. The destruction of public or private property, such as, for example, arsons against local politicians' cars, is the most common form of violence used in the Italian context, and it accounts for more than 90% of total cases. And this type of violence is then followed by physical assaults perpetrated by violent mobs and attacks by organized groups. And in a very limited number of cases, explosive devices were also implemented. And so, although Italy as a whole is the EU country recording the highest violence against local administrators, this violence is not evenly distributed across its territory. And in fact, 75% of such events are recorded in Italy's southern regions, mostly in Sicily, Campania, Calabria, and Apulia. And as it was mentioned before, the vast majority of these violent acts remain unclaimed, and often investigations are inconclusive, so it's not possible to know for sure who is behind them. However, it is worth observing that the regions where the most violence occurs are also the regions where mafia-style organized groups are the most present and active. And according to the data provided by the Italian Ministry of Interior, almost all municipalities that were dissolved for criminal infiltration between 2020 and 2021, and that were administered by an extraordinary commission, that is a measure applied where there is the real danger that the activity of a local government is bent to the interests of mafia-style organized criminal groups, are located in the same regions where local administrators are most targeted. So all in all, the significant presence of organized criminal groups in these regions and their ability to influence politics suggests the possible intimidatory nature of acts of violence recorded against local administrators. Next slide, please. So here is a picture of the rest of the EU. ACLED recorded 77 acts of violence targeting local administrators between 2020 and 2022. At the top, there is France with 24 events, followed by Germany with 11 events, and then come Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Bulgaria. As in the case of Italy, the most common form of violence implemented is the destruction of property, followed by violence perpetrated in the context of riots events or during organized attacks. And here again, in a very limited number of cases, also some explosive devices were used. Nearly 3/4 of events recorded by ACLED have no identified perpetrators. However, in a limited number of cases, motives behind such violence can be traced back to specific local, regional, or national decisions. For example, a number of events were driven by opposition to coronavirus measures. And in such cases, local administrators ended up being on the front line of the violence driven by frustration against local decisions, national decision. They often do not play a role in, or were perpetrated by far left or far right militant organizations and triggered by political ideology. So unlike criminal groups, militant groups often do claim responsibility for their attacks, emphasizing their ideological opposition to national policies or to the political affiliation of local administrators. Next slide, please. So finally, we are looking at the situation, how the situation is evolving in 2023 so far. The total number of events targeting local administrators in the EU as a whole has remained consistent during the first quarter of 2023. And again, as in the past years, the vast majority of events have no identified perpetrators. What has recorded a shift is the geographical distribution of this violence. And while Italy still produced most cases, it recorded only 12 events, while in the past, between 19 and 33 events were recorded in the first quarter of the year. As opposed to that, France has produced for the first time a number of events close to that of Italy. And such increase is mainly linked to two developments in the country. On the one hand, more than half of these events, violent acts, occurred in the context of violent demonstrations that followed the French government's decision to push through its pension reform. And on the other hand, this violence is linked to anti-French Corsican nationalist movements, whose action intensified in the last year. And while in the past, holiday homes of French citizens residing in the mainland represented their main target, 2 arson attacks against the town halls and 1 against the villa of a deputy mayor were recorded in Corsica in the first month of 2023. And violence against local administrators has also increased in Greece, where 4 events were recorded during the first quarter of the year, which is as many events as were recorded in the entire 2022. So to conclude, although all these events were not lethal, the persistence of these threats to local administrators across the EU in 2023 suggests that this phenomenon is unlikely to be brushed off from the continent. And while the EU is largely a peaceful region, these trends indicate that local administrators continue to be vulnerable to acts of violence, intimidation, and hate speech perpetrated by a number of different actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for these insights from across Europe. South Africa is another case of a known active conflict area where we record relatively high levels of violence against local politicians. And Susanna will help us navigate what actually is driving the violence there. Susanna, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Next slide, please. So in our data, 80% of our violence between 2018 and 2019 was targeted towards local officials. There was a 250% increase of violence in 2021 and a 70% increase in 2022. Although there's no definite answers to explain this increase, it is worth noting that during the 2016 elections, comparing that with the 2021 elections, main political parties like the African National Congress, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the Economic Freedom Fighters Party, their support has declined, whereas smaller parties like the Freedom Front Plus and the Inkatha Freedom Party have actually increased. And then also in our data, we've noticed that attacks and abductions account for 2/3 of the events that we recorded between this period. The KwaZulu-Natal province is at the epicenter of this violence. There's many reasons for this, but it is also rooted in the past and also what's currently happening. So in the past, the African National Congress and the Inkatha Freedom Party has worked together against the National Party, but due to ideological differences, they have parted ways, and we've seen the KwaZulu-Natal province particularly becoming a battleground between these two groups to secure territorial control, as well as establishing a support base. In our data, most of the violence is targeted towards African National Congress officials. So this leads us to ask the question, who is the perpetrators? Very often, due to a lack of arrests, the perpetrators are relatively unknown. And if they are caught, they're usually described as gunmen. And it is suspected they are likely have political links. There has also been professional hitmen being implicated in these events, including police. And then we've also noticed that there is very often political opponents also being implicated in these events. Speaking of inter-party competition that fuels this violence. So this leads to the question of what about the South African context lends itself to such a high and continuing risk that we see in our data. Next slide, please. So South Africa, interesting, the data surpasses similar violence that we see in Mali in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So one of the key drivers is during the transition from the apartheid system to the democracy, we've seen a competition between parties increasing. especially during the election period. This then ultimately indicates that violence is associated with democratic processes. Another driver is the party and inter-party competition to secure these positions. So attacks and threats function as to intimidate opponents in parties as well as between parties. It also serves as a deterrent for whistleblowers. Competition is also likely fueled by the position itself. So a local level position would ultimately mean that you have job security for 5 years, you have influence, and you can control the access to information and resources. Another driver is the decline in support for the African National Congress, which would also then increase party competition. Deteriorating public perceptions due to the high unemployment rates in the country, as well as corruption and service delivery issues, also fuels violence against local officials because they are the ones who control the resources and the information. As a result of this growing dissatisfaction, violent demonstrations and mob violence in our data accounts for 20 to 30% of the annual violence that we record between 2018 and 2022. Rioters frequently loot and destroy government offices, homes, and the homes of local authorities. Next slide, please. So the prospect of the continuing violence is that currently in 2023, we have already seen that rioting activity has increased by 40%. This is also likely attributed by the bleak economic conditions that we have in the country, as well as the environment of criminality and the persistence of corruption and the deterioration of support for the ruling African National Congress. This trend shows no sign of decelerating. In the first quarter of 2023, 8 local officials have already been killed across South Africa, including 2 in the KwaZulu-Natal province. Evidence of violence stemming from inter-party competition has also been reported in 2023. In this year, a former ANC Makondu local municipality mayor was arrested in connection with a fellow ANC councillor of the same ward. Following a turbulent election cycle in 2021, the 2026 municipal elections will likely be characterized by elevated and potentially deadly competition among candidates to secure a seat if the current driving forces that is leading to violence is not resolved. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna, for this exploration on a quite intricate case like South Africa. We now move over to Brazil, which is characterized, as we'll see in a minute, by kind of a combination of political and criminal factors driving violence against local officials and politicians. I'll leave the floor to my colleague Julia for her presentation on Brazil.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, I will talk about the drivers of political violence against local administrators, and will focus on organized crime as well as political polarization. So next slide, please. Organized criminal groups, they thrive in zones of social and political marginalization. So in these areas, they can enforce de facto control on a local level. In order for them to continue holding their hegemony in these territories, they have formed alliances with local politicians. In Brazil, we have 2 predominant types of organized crime. We have drug trafficking groups and police militias. Although they have a lot of similarities, and sometimes the line between them is blurry of which group is which, the main differential factor between the groups is that police militias, they have active participation of state officials as well as law enforcement agents and public agents in position of command. And the narrative they use to justify their legitimacy in marginalized areas is that they intend to protect the population from the drug traffickers, although they are just as violent as the drug traffickers. So the collusion between militias and politicians, they can create a system of mutual protection. So where politicians can provide legal cover to criminal actions of the militias, and the militias can bolster the electoral campaigns or gain over territorial under their control. Police militias are believed to be involved in the notorious killing of Councilwoman Marielle Franco in 2018. So although the motivation behind her death still remains unclear, it has been linked to her efforts to limit the expansion of militia groups in Rio de Janeiro. Another example is the killing of a former councilman in 2022, Jerônimo Guimarães Filho. He is a former councilman, and he was the founder of one of the most notorious police militia in Rio de Janeiro state, named Liga da Justiça. Next slide, please. As you can see here, the highest level of violence against local officials are registered in the states of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Coincidentally, both these states are home to the largest criminal organizations in the country, respectively, the First Capital Command, PCC, and the Red Command, the CV. Also, both São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are highly urbanized regions with dense population. They have a diverse political landscape with multiple political parties and factions vying for power. So this fragmentation can create rivalries and tensions among different groups, resulting in violent confrontations during electoral campaigns. Elsewhere, ACLED also registered high level of violence in the northeast of Brazil. In this region, these organized criminal groups such as the PCC and CV have forged alliances as well with local organized crime groups. Also, ACLED registered a number of attacks and killings in smaller municipalities of the interior part of the states. In these smaller municipalities, political rivalries, they passed on from generation to generation in given families who continue to perpetrate violence. So up until the 1960s, the municipalities were ruled by local oligarchies. With the subsequent rise of competition, the interests and power that previously belonged to a local family were being disputed, which we can see until today from generation to generation results from this violence. Next slide, please. Here in the slide, you can see the levels of violence against local officials since 2018 to 2022. We noticed a spike in 2020, which was the year of municipal elections in Brazil. In 2020, ACLED recorded 66 attacks against local politicians, which is a 27% increase from the previous year, 2019. And out of these 66 events, 32 led to the death of the victims. And most interestingly, the majority of events that were registered for 2022 were against candidates. So candidates counted for 96% of victims of political attacks in 2020. In 2021, the levels of violence targeting local officials remained high, although it was not an election year. But it was related as well with increasing political animosity in the country as officials struggled to coordinate an effective response against the coronavirus pandemic. So a health crisis turned into an ideological dispute, which led to further polarization. Also, the levels of violence continued to decrease in 2022. However, 2022 was a year of general elections in the country. And although it was a year of general elections, the majority of violence perpetrated against politicians were targeted at municipal level administrators. So ACLED recorded at least 42 events targeted at local administrators during the general election year of 2022. So you can see another example of how political polarization trickles down to lower levels of government. Next slide, please. So looking forward, several key factors are likely to drive the violence against local governments in the next years. We have the upcoming municipal elections in 2024 in Brazil, which will likely amplify existing party tensions. Furthermore, we also have set up, the Supreme Court has set up a mixed parliamentary commission to investigate the attacks on Congress that happened in January 2023. So since these investigations aim to identify organizers and financiers of the riots, they may lead to further disturbances in already established alliances and lead to potential violence. And lastly, ongoing investigations of the interference of organized crime in the latest elections in the state of Piauí and Rio de Janeiro points to continuous involvement of gangs and militias in the election. So these trends point to the enduring threat posed by organized crime in the political sphere and heightening the risk of violence in elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Before moving on to the Q&A session, and I see we've received already quite a few of them, we want to conclude this bird's eye view on our special issue with a case from the Philippines, where violence against local officials is typically associated with electoral competition between local elite families. And I leave the floor to Tomas for his examination.
Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here to present our data from the Philippines. The Philippines has long grappled with a high level of violence targeting local administration officials, particularly in relation to electoral competition between local elite families. And just very recently, we had a high-profile example of this in the assassination of a provincial governor, the governor of Negros Oriental province in March 2023, which made the rounds in the Philippine media and was consistently covered up to now, actually. But this violence has long persisted in the Philippine countryside. And the most notorious example of this in recent political history would be the so-called Maguindanao massacre of November 2009, in which 58 people were killed in a single attack masterminded by members of the Ampatuan clan against the rival Mangudadati family in the Maguindanao province. The attack is also thought to be the deadliest attack on the press in contemporary history, as 32 journalists were among those killed. And this attack also took the lives of several members of the Mangudadatu family during an election-related event. Can we move to the next slide, please? So we see very clearly from that example that the Maguindanao massacre example that such violence can take on a very brazen nature. But it is not only the brazen nature of this violence that is so alarming, but also its prevalence. As mentioned a while ago, the Philippines sees some of the highest levels of violence against local officials in the world. And ACLED records 716 acts of violence against local officials in the Philippines between 2018 and 2022. This violence is heavily concentrated in rural areas, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But one thing we do notice is that this violence, as I think we also saw for Mexico, increases during election periods. Next slide, please. So we see clearly from the visual here that there were spikes in the targeting of local officials in the Philippines around the election years of election months of 2019 and May 2019 and May 2022. And this shows how political competition drives spikes in the targeting of local officials, consistent really with the numerous studies investigating the phenomenon of election-related violence in the Philippines. And ACLED data shows that a significant increase, particularly around the May 13, 2019 elections, and also a few months after that, fresh into the terms of the newly elected officials, as well as in the May 2022 general elections that saw the transition between President Rodrigo Duterte and the new president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. So it might be interesting to ask whether the charged political atmosphere under the Duterte presidency, which featured, of course, his centerpiece agenda, the war on drugs, can be linked to higher violence against local officials. We do see that there were definitely some attacks that targeted some officials who were allegedly connected to the drug trade, but we also saw that it was not significant enough to establish as a major component of this phenomenon. That is to say, this phenomenon of violence targeting local officials. And that says that that shows that this phenomenon is clearly more deeply rooted than any single presidency. Yeah, and we can say that even though this data set only goes back to 2018. So next slide, please. So one thing we do see as well is that there were much of the targeting that we see in the Philippines takes place in the countryside, and particularly in the Bangsamoro administrative region in Muslim Mindanao. It's an autonomous region that enjoys greater institutional enjoys greater distance from institutional surveillance, given the autonomy that was secured from it in a previous plebiscite after decades of separatists struggles in that region. And slightly over 10% of violence targeting local officials occurred in that region, vis-a-vis the entire population of the Philippines. The BARMM would not actually be one of the most populated regions in the Philippines, as you see in the map. It is actually just like in the middle of the pack, and yet it sees a disproportionately higher level of violence compared to other regions. It is the second. It is the region that sees the second highest level of violence against local officials in the Philippines, at slightly over 10%, following only the most populated region, which would be Calabarzon. So one thing we do know from the Philippines is that much of this targeting that happens in the countryside is related to specific political dynamics. And this is also related to why a lot of the targeting happens during the election period. There are some key aspects of the Philippine political landscape that relate to this, and specifically the proliferation of political dynasties, and as well as a system of political patronage that they depend on for survival. Political dynasties refer to the capture of multiple or successive elective posts by the members of the same family. These are technically banned under the 1987 Constitution of the Philippines, but this has never been operationalized due to the lack of a required enabling law, which really has a poor chance of passing in the Philippine Congress, because the Philippine Congress, or the House of Representatives, is composed of a majority of members of political dynasties. As of 2016, 78% of the members of the House of Representatives of the Philippines were part of political dynasties. And so a lot of the violence that we see is actually connected to electoral competition between political dynasties, and not just in BARMM. But for example, we saw a case in 2019 where Amado Espino, a former governor and representative of Pangasinan province, was attacked by unidentified assailants who were connected to a member of a smaller political dynasty. This was, of course, we also know like the political dynasties were involved in the aforementioned 2009 Maguindanao massacre, because it was it happened in an election-related event that saw an attack on the Manguda Datus, who were a political family, perpetrated by unidentified. Then unidentified. I mean, the trial is now over, but hired assailants connected to the Ampatuan political family. So these dynamics in local politics have led observers of Philippine society to note the outsized impact of strong families in the Philippine countryside vis-a-vis the weakness of political parties, which in other contexts, of course, would be more of the vector of political movement. And this phenomenon, this violence has been referred to by the scholar Peter Kreutzer as phenomenon of violent self-help, in which members of local elite classes find a recourse to violence in order to secure their interests. yeah, so in the BARMM in particular, we saw that most of the violence take place in the two Maguindanao provinces. It used to be a single province. The two Maguindanao provinces of Maguindanao del Norte and Maguindanao del Sur, as you can see in the map, comprise nearly 3/4 of all violent events seen in this region. And this region clearly has been beset by is beset by a very difficult security situation. One is the phenomenon of FRIDO, or wars or clan wars, fighting between different clan militias over issues such as control of land or the contestation of political positions. And of course, the security landscape defined by the presence of armed groups such as the separatist Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which of course secured the autonomy of this region in the first place, and as well as Islamic State inspired breakaways such as the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters and the Abu Sayyaf group. And a telling example of the interplay between all these dynamics is that the perpetrators of the Maguindanao massacre of 2009 initially tried to pass on the blame to the MILF, which is one of the armed groups present in the region. And just in relation to the point about political dynasties, another notable thing about the Maguindanao provinces is that they were data from the 2019 midterm elections show that the Maguindanao province actually had the highest national rank in terms of the share of fat dynasties in elected office. Fat dynasties being defined as political dynasties with 2 or more members in elected office. In the Maguindanao provinces, 51% of elected posts were occupied by members of fat dynasties. So next slide, please. Just to end on this note that I think we've seen, I repeated a number of times. A lot of what's been driving the violence against local officials in the Philippines has been the recourse toward violence that we've seen among some provincial, rural elites, particularly those contesting elected posts. And just of some of the examples that I've mentioned, or the competition between the Abatuans and Datus in Maguindanao, the Espinos versus the Sisons in Pangasinan, and the most recent notorious example, the killing of the rivalry between Degamo and Teves in the province of Negros Oriental that saw the governor de Degamo killed on March 2023. That killing again had the same patterns, hired killers, unidentified assailants carrying out an operation after allegedly being contracted by members of the rival family. The Gamo case is somewhat atypical in that the assailants and the mastermind were identified with relative speed because state prosecutors are considering a member of the Teves family as who is a sitting member of Congress as the top mastermind in the killing. And that killing demonstrates how some locally powerful elites continue to feel emboldened to engage in violent self-help and secure their interests against those of a rival elite and also against the public interest. Thank you very much. That's all for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomas, and of course all presenters for these insights. We've got a number of questions, so I'll try to go straight into them and of course direct some of them to our speakers. Starting from some questions I see about the expansion of our research to other countries, such as Colombia, for example, or the United States. We have Afghanistan, Ethiopia. I see questions about Cameroon, for example. So let's say these special issues intended to be kind of the starting point of our work on these topics. So we released the data that they include data from across the world, so for all countries. But we will try definitely to expand also our research, especially for some of the most important cases. I guess again, some I see already here, like the Ethiopia. I think we'll have kind of a focus on the United States ahead of the elections, but we'll have other, conflict areas like Myanmar that we are hoping also to examine. So we'll continue to cover this topic and expand our focus to more countries. I also have a question about gender data. So I noticed the data set doesn't record the genders of the targets, a coding that would otherwise be extremely useful for research on violence against women in politics in particular, and discerning gendered patterns of violence in general. So I'd say, we have a specific project focusing on violence targeting women in politics. We haven't yet merged these two different projects. What I can say here is that we are first planning to expand also our tag to include more categories, even beyond local officials. And at the same time, we'll of course include, we'll try to include as much as possible also the information on gender. So also for the purpose of making these as accessible as possible, we'll try to include this information. I don't know if Cleona, do you want to add anything about this in particular?
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thank you to all the panelists. That was really fascinating. I do want to mention that, of course, our Ethiopia coverage is very extensive in the Ethiopian Peace Observatory, where we have addressed some recent assassinations that have occurred in Showa, and of course the ongoing troubles. So I would encourage people who are interested in the minutiae of the Ethiopian context to head over there, where we have information in both Amharic and English, and we have weekly and monthly reports. And in fact, I think we've just discovered that we have transcended 10,000 events that have been collected by that specific team. So it's really extensive. And as Andrea mentioned, there's every intention to continue these special case studies with Ethiopia. As far as the US, I would like to reiterate that, of course, during the elections in the US, we see a lot of new types of threats and risks emerge, and our focus on local official targeting will likely come around that period when we focus more on the electoral dynamics. But I really appreciate the interest in us extending the special issue and, of course, continuing the data made available to you through the tagging system. Thanks.
Thank you for the clarification. I have a few questions about specific case studies and countries that we've explored today. So I'll direct those questions to our speakers, and of course, us to provide concise answers if possible. So we have one question about Ukraine in particular. So for Nikita, so what happened to those officials who were kidnapped by the Russian forces over the past year? Were they released? Are they still in Russian hands? Do we know, what their fate has been?
A very good question. So you have about 80 abductions. As far as I can see, there were only 9 persons released, which means that about under 90% of the victims, we just do not know what happens next. ACLED is a living database, so whenever information is forthcoming, events are updated. If something really bad happens to the local officials, the sub-event type can also change. You also need to factor in that the media are more likely to report that someone was abducted rather than that someone was released. It's an important point to remember. And the second point is that most abductions occurred in the south, where Russian occupation is in full throttle, meaning that the informational controls are rather tight. And actually the mayors of the local officials from the areas who managed to get to government controlled areas are an important source of information in this regard.
Thank you, Nikita. So we have a question from the audience. What is the effect of attacks against local government officials on democracy, especially in regard to the constituencies of these public officials? So I guess it's kind of connected also to an idea I was mentioning in the beginning about the kind of short and long-term consequences. And I would perhaps direct this question to Julia, since I know there was already kind of a discussion around this kind of question and aspect of the violence. Julia Bernardi, of course.
Thank you, Andrea, for the question. So I would say that attacks against the local government officials can lead to a number of different consequences that can go from, I would say, the disruption of day-to-day administration activities to the influencing of current and future local policies. As we have seen in the Italian case, for example, it can lead to infiltration of criminal groups in the administration itself, and can also be used as a tool by criminal organization to obtain, for example, profitable public contract, and so infiltrate the public arena. And of course, as an immediate effect, this can lead to the resignation of public officials, but it can also make the work of public administrators less appealing as a long-term effect. So preventing potential candidates from running in the future. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thanks, Julia. And actually, this is also related to another question that we've got. Has ACLED done any research into the possible correlation between political violence and the participation in democratic processes within a population? For example, does an increase in targeted attacks on local officials correlate with a decrease in a metric such as voter turnout? Actually, this is a very interesting question. We haven't done any research as of now, but it's one of the things that we are possibly monitoring, and we'll try to study it. Again, as Julia, just to also reiterate what Julia was saying, there is a correlation. It's difficult to say, of course, if there is any causation, but at least in the Italian case, for example, there is a correlation in terms of degradation of governance. And so, for example, the dissolution of municipalities for criminal infiltrations. So that is a direct, of course, consequence, and violence is higher in these municipalities. So there is a correlation. That doesn't mean that in all cases we see a direct attribution of those events to criminal groups or to a specific group, but rather that there is an environment which is conducive to a degradation of institutions. And so we can assume also that, processes like participation to public life is also undermined. We'll monitor that, and we'll possibly conduct also some research. We have a few questions about Mexico, which has generated some interest, and of course I'll direct these to Sandra. Let me just okay. So if you can speak a little more about Veracruz, and so of course you mentioned that Veracruz is one of the states that has some of the highest levels of violence against local officials in the country. and at the same time also whether we see any alignment with violence against groups such as non-governmental organizations, indigenous groups. And so if you can provide, again, a quick focus about the Chiapas or Oaxaca, again, areas in which you mentioned, particularly Oaxaca, you mentioned that there is a response in terms of violence. So over to you if you can answer these questions, these broad questions, of course.
Sure, I'll do my best to answer those questions. Thanks for sending them out. So in terms of violence in Veracruz, so yeah, indeed, local official targeting has led in the state of Veracruz. So far this year in Veracruz, local official targeting has been consistent with levels of violence recorded in previous years. In terms of the kind of threats that are being that local officials face in Veracruz, there've been obviously direct attack have been the prevailing type of threat faced by those officials, as seen recently, for instance, with the killing of a city hall worker in Mizantla. Their overall violence has been mainly attributed to turf war between the Jalisco New Generation cartel and Los Zeta criminal groups, the former of which has established control in several municipalities. So what we can expect in this state is that organized crime, especially the CGNG, will likely continue to exert pressures on local politicians and candidates, either to make sure they align with their interests or to deter them from running in elections, as we've seen with the targeting of several candidates. Interestingly, in Veracruz, and I'll probably wrap up here on Veracruz, we see that and ahead of elections, there's been an increase in the targeting of private properties, which here is an interesting finding because it also applies to other states, as it highlights that physical violence and assassinations might be used, but as a last resort by perpetrators, and that local officials are likely to be threatened far more than we can record with indirect threats, verbal threat, and so on. And this has been something quite prevalent in the state of Veracruz. Now, in terms of the targeting of activists, especially in the states of Chiapas and Oaxaca, so right now, we're working to enrich our data to easily keep track of violence that has been targeting activists more specifically. What we can currently track in our data set is violence targeting members of the indigenous communities. And similar to what we observe with the correlations between overall levels of violence and local official targeting in those states, the targeting of members of the indigenous community is one of the highest, or at least the number of events in Oaxaca and Chiapas. So here we've seen similar trends, but then we will definitely need to investigate this further, look what's behind the violence, who are the perpetrators, if this related to land conflicts and so on. I hope I answered to those questions.
Thanks, Sandra. So we also have a few questions about Brazil, and actually one question about Brazil specifically, and one question for Julia in particular. So first, if you can speak a little more about the Amazonas region in Brazil, which I know you, of course, you didn't have the time to go through it, but if there was any violence against local officials in that region, and then if you can if you've done any work around the protection protocols or the law and policies that can be enacted to enhance the protection or prevent violence against local officials or municipal candidates in Brazil specifically.
Thank you. They're both good questions. Well, as you mentioned, I couldn't talk about the violence in the Amazon region due to because it will be too long of a presentation. But we did register violence against local officials in the states that comprise the Amazon basin in Brazil. And especially, I'm glad you mentioned this because looking forward, recently, the current administration launched an operation in the Amazon to remove illegal miners from indigenous territory. However, these illegal miners are associated with the PCC, as I mentioned, the largest criminal group in Brazil. And some of them decided to stay in the region and confront state forces. And since this is related to an operation of the current government, this might lead to future violence in upcoming elections, especially because on the last elections, at least 70 candidates were allegedly linked to illegal miners. So we might see an increase in violence against local administrators in the Amazon region in the upcoming elections. I hope this answered the question about the Amazon. About law and policy and security measures, I think there are some things we can do, especially around elections and election years, especially to protect candidates. So some of them might be, of course, enforcing already existing laws, but also providing security training and support for candidates, which can include threat assessments, guidance, and safety protocols. Another thing that could be done is cooperation between political parties so they can work together and promote a peaceful electoral environment. Another thing that is very important as well to keep an eye on is social media regulation. So address the spread of hate speech and misinformation that can incite violence on social media platforms. And another point that can be used is also international cooperation, like foster an exchange between best practices among other countries. So, so each country can learn from each other what they can implement to secure a safer and peaceful election.
Thanks, Julia. I know we have time just to answer one or two questions, but we'll do our best also to answer all the remaining questions via email. So apologies for not getting onto them now. We have a question about expanding our analysis to other areas like Myanmar and Afghanistan in particular. So for the purpose of your research and analysis, will you consider the local level officials of Myanmar military and the Taliban as local officials, as both belong to the de facto ruling authorities in these two countries? So of course, our data already cover these two countries, and what we've done is to consider these, de facto authorities as, among our local officials catchment. The Myanmar case is especially tricky because there is, of course, a fine line between civilian and military elements. But I think that for the purpose of providing kind of a useful resource, we extended our coverage to, of course, include the local representatives of the military junta, which of course may also have a role in the military or security institutions. So I can answer as being with a yes, and of course we'll be we're happy to answer any follow-up questions should you have any. And the other question is whether we would be considering adding another subset relating to violence against, for example, trade union activists, organizers, and more. As I mentioned before, we are expecting to expand the coverage of our tab, which again currently covers only local officials. So we are currently working on deciding whether to include, for example, more political officials, whether at the national level, or also like trade union activists, social leaders, like in the case of Latin America, which is of course a very useful kind of identity to include. So we'll provide updates to all of our users, but we'll take this feedback and of course any other feedback as something also useful for our own internal discussions. With this in mind, I leave the floor to Cleona for some concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, both, of course, to Andrea for being an excellent moderator and all of the panelists. I think everybody has learned a tremendous amount, both about the general patterns and the specific instances. I really appreciate the audience and the fantastic questions. We'll be following up with some, especially around elections. And I invite you to attend more of our webinars where we will be outlining and, of course, reviewing our extensive analysis. And I appreciate your patience today. And thank you very much.